Why are the stars disappearing, Baba? The little boy's voice broke the silence of the cold night. His father looked up at the smoke-filled sky, the orange glow of hundreds of backyard furnaces painting their village in a haunting hue. He didn't answer immediately. What could he say? That the stars had not vanished, but were swallowed by the fire of a dream too big to breathe. This was China in 1958, a nation that had survived invasion, civil war, and poverty for generations. A country just beginning to rebuild itself under the Communist Party's banner, led by the charismatic and visionary Mao Zedong. Mao believed China could transform, not gradually, but instantly. He didn't want slow progress. He wanted a miracle, and that miracle was the Great Leap Forward. At the heart of the countryside, a family named Li lived in a small village in Henan province. The father, Li Jung, a war veteran and peasant farmer, had survived the Japanese occupation, the civil war between nationalists and communists, and years of famine and flood. He had little formal education, but his eyes carried the wisdom of survival. His wife, Lian, quiet and kind, worked tirelessly in the fields and raised their children, 12-year-old Li Wei, and his little sister, 6-year-old Li Mei. Like millions of others, they believed in the promise of a new China. They had nothing to lose and everything to hope for. When Mao announced the Great Leap Forward in 1958, it sounded like salvation. The plan was to mobilize the entire population into massive collective efforts. Backyard furnaces would be built to smelt steel in every village. Fields would be cultivated under new farming theories. People would live communally, eat together, work together, succeed together. It wasn't just an economic movement. It was a spiritual one. A leap of faith. Local officials arrived in the Li family's village with red banners and posters of Mao. Speeches were delivered. The people clapped. The village's small farms were merged into a giant commune. Private plots, tools, livestock, all became the property of the people. The Li family's oxen, which had helped plow their land for a decade, were now part of the commune's shared herd. Their cooking utensils, even their prized iron wok inherited from Lian's mother, were thrown into a furnace to produce steel. When Wei asked his father why they had to melt their own belongings, Li Jung replied solemnly, "So the nation can stand tall." The first few weeks felt like a festival. There was music, energy, and pride. Neighbors who had once worked quietly behind their own doors now toiled together, shoulder to shoulder. Communal kitchens served hot meals to workers. Teams of villagers harvested wheat under giant slogans: more grain, more steel, more revolution. Even Wei felt something powerful in the air. He and his friends gathered scrap metal, watched the fires dance in the night, and dreamed of becoming engineers and leaders in a mighty China. But underneath the joy, something was wrong. Farming methods were changed rapidly under new scientific models promoted by the party: deep plowing, close planting, and collective irrigation. But the soil couldn't breathe. Crops didn't grow the way they used to. Despite this, village leaders, desperate to prove their loyalty, inflated grain production numbers. They claimed the fields had yielded 10 times more than they actually had. Those numbers traveled up the chain of command, where they were used to set government grain quotas. The state took the grain that didn't exist. The communal kitchens began to run out of food. First, meat disappeared, then vegetables, then rice and flour. People were told to forage. They were told to tighten their belts for the revolution. In reality, they were starving. In the Li village, one winter night in 1959, the communal kitchen served a thin soup made of grass and boiled tree bark. Mei, now growing weaker by the day, looked up at her mother and asked, "Mama, when will the rice come back?" Lian could not answer. Her lips were cracked from dehydration. Her arms were thin. She pulled Mei into her lap and hummed a lullaby from the old days, tears falling silently. Wei began sneaking out at night, searching the hills for edible roots. His father, once proud and stoic, now sat for hours in silence. He had given everything: his home, his tools, his beliefs, for a promise that now felt like a curse. He still believed in China, in Mao, in the revolution. But belief doesn't fill empty stomachs. By spring, villages started dying. The first were the elderly, then the infants, then the young mothers. Disease followed hunger. In desperation, some families boiled leather shoes, some ate clay. May's small body, once full of laughter and curiosity, could no longer stand. She stopped speaking. Her eyes dimmed. She died on a morning in early 1960, while her brother sat beside her holding her hand, humming the lullaby their mother had sung. She was buried in a shallow grave at the edge of the field, wrapped in the same red cloth they had once used to celebrate the revolution. Her mother placed a tiny wooden doll beside her body, the only toy she'd ever owned. No ceremony, no tombstone, just silence. That year, the famine worsened. It wasn't just in Henan. It was in Anhui, Gansu, Sichuan, across the nation. By the end of 1960, tens of millions had died. The government still reported success. Official radio broadcasts played triumphant music, praising steel production and rising grain outputs. Behind closed doors, however, the truth began to emerge. Mao's advisors, including Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, began pushing for change. They visited the provinces. What they saw horrified them. Liu Shaoqi openly told Mao, "The people say you're responsible." Mao, wounded but aware, began stepping back from the day-to-day governance. Quietly, reforms began. Communes were reduced. Private farming was reintroduced in some areas. Grain requisitions were relaxed. The famine slowed. In 1961, the Li family received permission to grow their own food on a tiny plot of land. Wei, now 16, planted sweet potatoes with his father. His mother, still grieving Mei, worked in silence. That year, they survived. The years that followed were not easy. The Cultural Revolution would soon upend the nation again. But the famine, the pain of the Great Leap, left deep, permanent scars. It taught the people hard lessons. That faith must be matched by reason, that dreams without planning lead to nightmares, and that survival often comes not from ideology, but from love, courage, and small acts of defiance. Li Wei eventually left the village. He became a schoolteacher in the city. He taught history, not the kind written only by the victors, but the kind whispered by survivors. He told his students about the Great Leap, not just the slogans, but the starvation. Not just the steel, but the silence. He told them about Mei, and the song she sang before she died. In 1980s China, under Deng Xiaoping, the country changed again. Markets opened, cities grew, factories multiplied, poverty decreased, roads, power lines, and skyscrapers stretched across the land. China began rising, not in a blind leap, but step by step, learning from the past. Behind this rise was a generation that had endured more than the world could imagine. The story of the Great Leap Forward is not just about policies gone wrong. It's about families like the Lees. About sacrifices that should never have been demanded. About promises broken. And about those who still managed to live, to rebuild, and to believe again. Today, when we look at China's meteoric rise, its global power, its industrial might, its cities that stretch to the sky, we must remember the foundation it was built on. Not just concrete and steel, but the bones of those who came before. The silence of children like Mei. The resilience of mothers like Lian. The loyalty of men like Li Jung. The endurance of boys like Wei. Because real greatness is not measured in tons of steel or false reports of grain. It is measured in how a people survive the darkest nights. And China, against all odds, through fire, frost, and famine, survived. It rose.